Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the KDI School World Bank monthly webinar series. My name is Yeonji Kim, and I'll be serving as your MC for today's webinar. Before we get started, please note that today's webinar will be recorded for knowledge sharing purposes. This webinar is our joint venture with the World Bank, where experts from the bank will share their recent findings with the school community. We hope you gain exclusive insights into the cutting-edge research by the bank and have time to reflect on possible applications. If you have any questions or comments, please wait for the Q&A session or leave your messages in the chat. Now, I'm pleased to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Ms. Dana Vorisek and Dr. Mirco Balatti. Let me briefly introduce each of them in order. Ms. Dana Vorisek is a lead economist in the World Bank Prospects Group. She is a lead author of Global Economic Prospects, the bank's flagship report on the global economy. Her work focuses on productivity, investment, inflation, and oil price shocks, and she has covered regions including Latin America and the Middle East and North Africa. Dr. Mirco Balatti is an economist in the World Bank's Prospects Group, where he focuses on global economic research and forecasting. His interests include macroeconomics, international and financial economics, and quantitative methods. Prior to joining the World Bank, he worked at the European Central Bank and contributed to key models such as BEAR, MC, and BEAST. He has also taught at the ICMA Center, Henley Business School, and held roles in the private sector. He holds a PhD from the ICMA Center and was a visiting scholar at Northwestern University. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Ms. Vorisek and Dr. Balatti. Ms. Vorisek and Dr. Balatti, please share your slides when you're ready to begin.
Thank you very much, Yeonji. And welcome to everyone else here who I'm not able to see, but I trust you're here. Let me advance to full screen. Okay, you can see that well?
Yeah, we can see.
Perfect. Okay. So just to give a very brief introduction about the material we will cover tonight, the content will be derived from one chapter of our recent Global Economic Prospects report. So this is a flagship publication, as Yeonji mentioned, that the World Bank publishes 2 times per year in January and June. And this is one of the analytical chapters of January report. So we will not go deeply into global economic forecasts or surveillance issues of high frequency data, but this chapter is more of a look at structural issues with a lot of analytical content. So I will turn over to Mirco to begin, and I will come back in a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Dana, and thank you to the KDI School for giving us the possibility to present this work. So as Dana said, this is chapter 3 of the January 2025 JEF, and we will structure the presentation in 4 main questions. The first one relates to how the integration of EMDs into the global economy and how that has evolved over time. For the second question, we will look at business cycle linkages between EMDs and the rest of the world. And for the question number 3, we'll look at the main economic challenges facing EMDs, while we'll conclude with the question number 4 on the key policy interventions that EMDs should focus on. If we start with the first question on EMD integration on the next slide, I don't see the slide turning. Okay, so we thought being in 2025, it was a good moment to run a stock-taking exercise on the first quarter of the 21st century. The period at the turn of the 21st century was a defining period for EMDs and marked a pivotal shift for these economies. Why? Because during that time, a strong policy consensus emerged on the benefit of global integration, and that allowed cross-border economic linkages to expand rapidly as EMDs integrated into the global economy. Reforms improved the functioning of domestic markets, but also there were reforms were carried out to strengthen the monetary and fiscal policy frameworks. Because all of this, these domestic and external growth factors, which we call tailwinds, these EMDs, this group of countries experienced unprecedented growth during the period between 2000 and 2008. Actually, their average annual growth was about 5.9% per annum. And this was actually their strongest expansion since the 1970s. Let me turn to the footprint on actually the previous slide, please, on EMDs on the global economy. Let me start with showing on the left panel the share of global GDP, which we split between advanced economies in yellow and emerging markets in red and blue. Actually, at the beginning of the 2000s, emerging market economies accounted for about a quarter of global GDP, but that share increased in 2024 to nearly 45%. A big driver of this increase were the three largest emerging market economies, which we call throughout the presentation EM3. And these are China, India, and Brazil. And these economies have actually been central to this transformation, as you can see from the blue area. During this period, actually, the share of global GDP stemming from these three economies grew from about 10% to about 25% in the recent years. So we can also see this shift in global growth dynamics on the right panel, where we showed the shares of global GDP growth. And here, what we can see is that in the 90s, EMDs accounted for about 30% of global growth. But by the 2000s, their share jumped to nearly 60%, doubling this, the contribution of emerging market economies to global growth, and has since remained more or less at that level. What this means is that today, actually, most of the economic expansion comes from the EMDs and not advanced economies. So what we can also, the bottom line is that, EMDs have a large footprint in the global economies, and they're not peripheral players anymore. They are major growth engines. If we move to the next slide, I will show you the integration and economic linkages and how this has evolved over time. We think of integration and economic linkages mainly in three main channels: trade, commodities, and financial linkages. Starting with the left panel, we can see that the shares of global exports from EMDs rose from about 20% in 2000 to about 40% in the most recent years. And this obviously reflects their deeper participation in global production networks. Not only they have increased their share of global exports, but also intra-EMDs trade has surged significantly during this time. And actually now in the last few years, about half of EMDs good exports go to other EMDs compared to only 25% in 2000. If we move to the middle panel, we can see that EMDs have become the largest consumers of primary energy, and they have actually surpassed advanced economies since 2004. If we were to plot this for metal consumptions, we would see a very similar picture. And just to put the numbers, before 2000, they were consuming about 45% of global energy. But this number rose to about 67% in the most recent years. The key drivers behind this were the rapid industrialization, urbanization, as well as population growth. So obviously, this gives you a picture of commodity consumption, but let's not forget that emerging markets are also major producers and exporters of commodities. Moving to the financial markets, on the right-hand side, we can see various indicators of financial flows. Here we plot FDIs, foreign direct investment, portfolio investments, and other investment. But let me just say that their share of the share of EMD's global capital flows rose from about 6% in the period between 2000 and 2004 to about 21% over the most recent years. And this reflects their growing attractiveness as investment destinations. However, we did see a rise of integration at financial level for these economies, but their level of financial integration still remains more limited compared to advanced economies. If we move on to the next slide, we will switch to business cycle linkages. So we see, how this integration has evolved over the last 25 years, and now we'll see how these business cycles have evolved over time, and in particular, their interaction. If moving to the next slide, we see the synchronization of EMD's business cycles. This is, as expected, we see that the business cycles have become more synchronized, also due to the higher cross-border linkages. And in particular, here we measure synchronization in two main ways, looking at concordance and correlation metrics. If we start with the left panel, we see how the concordance ratio, which measures the proportion of time that two economies are in the same phase of the business cycles, or in other words, what is the share of time that they are both in an expansion phase or both in a recession phase. This concordance ratio for emerging market rose from about 60% in the 90s to about 80% in the 2020s. And actually, this has increased both within emerging market, but also between emerging market and advanced economies. If we move to the middle panel, we see the correlation of GDP growth. And in particular, here, for this exercise, we remove the extreme global shocks, recessions, and subsequent rebounds, because we know that in those periods, correlation of GDP growth increases. But even if we adjust for this, what we see is that the 2020s are showing much higher correlation compared to previous decades, both across EMDs, but also between EMDs and advanced economy. Lastly, going back to the concordance ratio on the right panel, what we do is we measure the average pairwise concordance ratio of all countries globally, and we rank the most synchronized countries. And in particular here, we just plot the top quartile of the most synchronized countries over time. And what we can see is that in the 90s, only about half of the most synchronized economies were emerging markets, and the other half being advanced economies. However, since 2000, EMDs have dominated and now comprise about 3/4 of the most synchronized economies in the world. If we move to the next slide, we further explore co-movements with a dynamic factor model. This dynamic factor model has three main factors: the global factor, which captures all common co-movements across all countries in the world; a group factor that is specific to advanced economies and emerging markets. So this captures only co-movements that are common either between advanced economies or between emerging markets. And the last factor is the idiosyncratic factor. So this is the country-specific factor. So these are the movements that are and do not fall within the global or the group factor. But what we find is that the business cycle and fluctuations in EMDs are increasingly shaped by common factors. And in particular, starting on the left, we see that in the early 2000s, EMD's growth fluctuations were largely idiosyncratic. But by the 2010s, we see the rise and the emergence of the EMD-specific business cycle, and which explained about 25% of total business cycle variations, and also more than doubling its influence compared to the 2000. If we were to, while in the 2020s, we see a rise of the importance of the world or global factor because of the global pandemic recession that hit all countries in the world. If we move to the right side, we see that, if we were to plot these pictures for the largest three EMDs, again, China, India, and Brazil, what we see is that these EMD-specific business cycle factor in the 2010s actually explain over 30% of business cycle fluctuations as these countries integrated more and more into the global economy. So the key takeaways here is that over the last 2 decades and a half, these external factors have become more dominant, while domestic factors have diminished in relative terms. But we see again, through various metrics that synchronization has increased both within EMDs but also between advanced economies and emerging markets. And this is driven by their trade, financial, and commodity linkages that I showed you earlier. Moving on to spillovers, what we see, I've presented integration and I've presented findings about synchronization. But let's now study or see what happens when one country or a group of countries hit by a shock, by a GDP shock, what happens to the other countries. In order to answer to this question, we estimate a Bayesian structural VR model. And I will not go into the details, but this VAR model also comprises 3 groups of countries. Our EM3 aggregate, China, India, and Brazil, an aggregate comprised of other emerging markets and developing economies. And the third and last aggregate is what we call A3 aggregate. And this includes the largest 3 advanced economies in the world, which are the US, the Euro area, and Japan. What we plot here are the impact of growth shocks in emerging markets, in the major emerging markets and major advanced economies. What we can see starting with the left-hand side chart is that 1 percentage point growth shock in EM3 leads to about 1.9% cumulative output expansions in other EMDs over a 3-year period. This shows, the growing interdependence among the EMDs, but also that, these countries, these largest EMDs, have sizable spillovers onto other emerging markets. However, if we compare these spillovers from advanced economies, our A3, US, Euro, and Japan, these spillovers remain larger compared to the spillovers stemming from emerging markets. And the effect on other emerging markets are about twice the effect as the ones from our EM3 aggregate. If we move to the middle panel, we see how these spillovers affect the global economy. So we are expanding the universe here. And in particular, we see that the growth shocks in A3 expands global GDP growth over a 3-year period by about 3% cumulative, while a similar shock in EM3 results in an increase of GDP at the global level of about 1%. We also study how spillovers have evolved over time. And in particular, we take 2 30-year samples to study this. You see the result of this in the right side panel. And in particular, we see that before 2001, growth shocks from EM3 had limited or near zero impact on other emerging markets. But over the last 30 years, so in the period from 1993 to 2023, the cumulative spillovers effects from EM3 increased to about 2%, reflecting their higher integration. So the bottom line here is that large emerging markets, and in particular our EM3, China, India, Brazil, can generate significant economic spillovers, but the large advanced economies spillovers still appear to be larger. That's it on my side, and I will give the floor back to Dana for question number 3 and 4. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mirco. So I will turn now, to this third question on the economic challenges facing EMDEs. So the sort of big narrative that came out of the material that Mirco just presented was that EMDs are, their footprint on the global economy is growing, that they are becoming more integrated, and those things are true. But there are also some qualifications to that story, right? That this era of very rapid growth, of increasing very rapid integration, happened mostly 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, and the pace of that change has slowed over time. So let me walk you through some of the things that I mean when I'm saying this, starting with GDP growth itself. So in the left chart here, this is just tracking growth in EMDEs and EMDEs excluding China over time. And you can see this steady slowdown in the pace of growth, right? So in the 2000s, growth was about 6% in EMDEs, then about 5% in the 2010s, and finally about 3.5% so far in the 2020s. And the other thing to take away from this chart on the left is that this is not just a story about China, right? So if you exclude China from this aggregate, on a GDP weighted basis, you get this very similar step down pattern slowing over time. And then turning to the middle chart here, what worries us perhaps even more than the slowdown in growth is that per capita income growth has also slowed over time. So the way to interpret the positive and negative in this chart is that if the bar is positive, it means that EMDEs are converging toward per capita incomes in advanced economies. And if the value is negative, it means they are diverging, right? So that their per capita incomes are growing more slowly than what is observed in advanced economies. And what you can see is that from the 2000s to the 2020s, you see this very similar pattern of the blue bar getting lower over time. And in the most recent years, if you exclude China and India from EMDEs, these countries, altogether are very much diverging from per capita growth rates in advanced economies. And then on the right side, you see sort of a similar story in the pace of poverty reduction. It was pretty fast in the 1990s and the 2000s. And, since the global financial crisis from 2010 onward, the pace has been much slower. Let me turn now to a few structural challenges, starting on the left side with investment growth. So by investment here, I am talking about gross fixed capital formation, so the component of demand side GDP. And here you see a remarkably similar picture to what you saw on the previous slide for GDP growth, that investment growth has really slowed over time. I won't recite the numbers here, but 70% of EMDEs had slower investment growth in the most recent years in the 2020s relative to the 2000s. At the same time, we've seen basically no improvement in investment climate. So what do we mean by this is, business conditions, the likelihood of private sector wanting to invest in a country given the conditions on the ground in the country. And you see in the center chart here that basically this is unchanged over time, right? That, on average, the situation has not improved in EMDEs at all. So the problem with this is that investment is associated not just with higher GDP growth, but also with higher productivity growth, right? And over time, there has been a generalized waning, a decrease in the pace of productivity growth in these countries, which is concerning from their ability for these countries, which we saw in the previous slide, to catch up on a per capita basis to incomes in advanced economies. And then finally, on the right side here, this is just showing trade as a share of GDP. And what this is pointing out is not things that have been in the news recently about increased trade restrictions, but rather the sort of sea change that happened about the time of the global financial crisis, where the slowdown in the growth of global value chains. So this model that some countries had previously very successfully followed in the 1990s and the 2000s of integrating into the global economy and trading more and getting involved in certain parts of the manufacturing chain has really become very much more difficult over time. And this is what is shown in this chart, that the outcome is trade as a share of GDP has basically flatlined in EMDs since about 2010. Let me turn to fiscal and debt conditions, right? This is not news to anyone who has been paying attention to the news in recent years, that fiscal conditions in emerging markets have become much more challenging. So on the left side, you can see government debt as a share of GDP and also debt costs. And what I'll just highlight from here is debt to GDP ratio was about 70% of in EMDEs in 2024. This compares to 37% in 2010. So there's been a very, very large increase over these years. And at the same time, debt service costs have increased, right? They're standing now at about 8% of GDP. That is not insignificant, and has grown since the 2010s. On the right side, a little bit of good news is that EMDEs have managed to improve their ability to raise revenues over time. Revenue mobilization in these countries traditionally has been very challenging and still continues to be very challenging for many countries. But they have managed, bit by bit to improve the situation. But the other side of this, of this balance, on the expenditure side, expenditure as a share of GDP has increased more than the revenue over GDP has increased. So the net outcome of this is that basically fiscal deficits have increased over time. In the 2020s, there's on average a 4 percentage point of GDP difference between expenditure and revenues. That compares to about 1% in the 2000s. So let me turn back to more pressing things that are maybe not pressing, but more front of mind things right now on trade. So these charts in sum essentially make it clear that the environment of economic cooperation that characterized the beginning of the 21st century has really very much wound down. The chart on the left is showing a measure, an index of global trade policy uncertainty. This doesn't say anything about actual trade. It just says, how uncertain is the policy environment. And what you can see is that there's been a very, very large increase over time. Trade uncertainty in the 2020s is more than 3 times higher than it was in the 2000s. And that follows, a pretty big increase that already happened during the 2010s. So this environment of uncertainty is not all that has changed. Actual trade policy, of course, has also become much more restrictive. Turning to the center chart here, what this is showing on the left side, the contribution means, how many new trade distorting policy measures were introduced by the 2 groups of countries shown here. And what you can see is that the new measures introduced have increased in both advanced economies and EMDEs. But then on the right side is showing the exposure. So which countries are, feeling the of these trade distorting measures. And what we can see is that that EMDEs are disproportionately bearing the negative consequences of these policies. And then a very similar story on the right side here about new FDI restricting measures, right? These have also increased over time. They're about double in the 2020s than compared to the 2010s. If you looked at other statistics, they would tell a very similar story. So, for example, between 2020 and 23, there were on average 5 new trade agreements per year in the whole world. That compares to 11 per year in the 2010s and 13 per year in the 2000s. So it's just one more thing telling you that this trade, this global environment has very much changed and become increasingly difficult for EMDs. I'll touch just briefly on this. It's just saying simply that the impact or the frequency rather of natural disasters on the left side has increased over time substantially, right? So some of this may be capturing, improved capacity to collect data, but really there has been a marked increase over time in the frequency of events. And at the same time, the right chart is not showing this specifically, but the damages from these events has also increased over time. And then the right chart is just showing that in small economies and even across various regions are by dint of their geography and also their the fact that their GDP is inherently small. So when they are hit by a major event like a hurricane or a major storm, the impacts for the domestic GDP are very large. So that was a review of several of the key challenges that EMDs are facing. The chapter has a lot of material that I will not go through in detail here, but on policy interventions. So the way we organize it in the report is in these 3 broad buckets of boosting investment and productivity, of enhancing macroeconomic stability and resilience, and then finally navigating the difficult external environment. So let me just say a few words about this first bucket on boosting productivity and investment. We've done some good research, not in this report, but in the past, basically associating periods of rapid and strong investment growth with some other good outcomes, right? So not just GDP growth, but also higher productivity growth. And then the business conditions are, capturing conditions on the ground. I won't go much more into the details of that. I'll also very briefly say a few words. The report goes into many details, but essentially EMDs need to keep their macroeconomic house in order, right? So this is building and maintaining fiscal buffers, and also maintaining credible, disciplined monetary policy. And then I'll say a few more words about the third bucket on navigating the difficult external environment. So let me start with the left chart here. And this maps to this first bullet on pursuing trade and investment partnerships with willing partners. So one of the points we make in the report is that, yes, the external environment has become more difficult, but, the difficult environment does not necessarily capture every single one of your own trading partners, right? So there is capacity, we think, for EMDs to pursue not just more trade agreements, but deeper trade agreements with countries in their own regions and with countries in other regions. So I'll give you a few interesting statistics. If fully and effectively implemented, measures to facilitate trade and FDI under the African Continental Free Trade Area stand to boost exports from Africa by more than 30%, and intra-regional exports by more than 100% in the course of just a decade. Incomes in Africa could be raised by 7% under the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Similar story for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia. World Bank research has found that increasing trade among the members to the maximum allowed levels, or to the maximum allowed under restrictions on in this trade partnership could increase trade among partners by 12% and real incomes by 2.5%. And then finally, looping back to what is actually shown in the left chart here, this is, a hypothetical exercise where if you increased trade within the region rather that your country is in, this is the average increase in output that countries within each region would experience. So it's the highest for Latin America and the Caribbean and South Asia. Let me go back to the second bullet here on reducing the costs of trade, specifically through domestic reforms. So what you can see on the right side in this chart is that EMDEs have long faced much higher costs of trade than advanced economies. These costs have decreased over time. So this blue bar has now become more short over time. But there is still quite a lot of capacity for EMDs to do things within their own borders. There is much gains to be made from improving logistics, from improving transportation and infrastructure. This is not fully feasible for every single country. You can think of, for example, an island country, right? That country is at a disadvantage for transportation costs. But within their own borders, EMDs can ensure that ports are operating efficiently. They can improve the quality of roads. They can decrease the amount of red tape it requires to export goods. And finally, briefly going through the final three bullets here, we feel that EMDEs have a lot to gain from diversifying exports. So this traditional model of focusing on only goods exports is one way to go, but increasingly services make up a larger share of global trade. So that is sort of where we see the future, right? So EMDEs need to create jobs. They need to create more productive jobs. The global market is tilting more towards services. Some of these can be carried out through digital means. So these are things that EMDs need to think about in the future. And this fourth bullet on protecting people, this essentially means that if you have workers who are adversely impacted by specific conditions in the global trade environment, you should be to the extent possible prepared to provide temporary income support or retraining programs or targeted tax policy changes. And then finally, just to say a few words on advocacy, the conditions out there are quite tough at the moment, but there still is capacity for EMDEs to band together and to advocate for themselves in international fora on trade. So to summarize here, we went through these 4 questions on integration, business cycle linkages and spillovers, on economic challenges, and on key policy interventions. This is to give you a very, very brief overview of other work we are doing, right? So we are talking now about one single chapter of this report here, but we have many other products that are produced by our team, all publicly accessible on our website. That's it. Thank you very much.